In the heart of Apo, a bustling city alive with lights and sounds, Vera lived a life many envied. She was the kind of woman whose beauty turned heads and made strangers smile. Her husband, David, was just as striking, a tall, charming man whose laughter could brighten the darkest day. Together, they built a home filled with love, warmth, and laughter. Their lives were picture-perfect, especially with the arrival of their baby, a bubbly 1-year-old who brought even more joy to their home. Vera often marveled at her life, wondering how she had been so blessed. She and David shared everything: dreams, laughter, and whispered secrets late at night. People who knew them often said they were made for each other. But sometimes, life has a way of shifting the ground beneath you when you least expect it. One bright afternoon, Vera's best friend, Evelyn, arrived at their doorstep. Evelyn had been her friend since childhood, and Vera welcomed her like a sister. Evelyn was bold, confident, and had a laugh that could fill a room. Though their personalities were different, Vera loved her like family. David, too, greeted Evelyn warmly. At first, Evelyn's visits were harmless. She came over often, sharing stories and catching up with Vera. She adored Vera's baby and even helped with chores. To Vera, having her best friend around felt like a blessing. But over time, Evelyn's visits started to change. One evening, David seemed distracted at dinner. He barely touched his food and avoided looking at Vera. When she asked what was wrong, he shrugged it off, saying he was tired from work. It was the first crack in the perfect life they shared. But Vera convinced herself it was nothing. Little did she know, her world was about to unravel. The changes were small at first. David seemed quieter, more reserved. He began leaving for work earlier and returning home later than usual. When Vera asked, he told her it was because of a big project at the office. She believed him, trusting him completely. Evelyn, however, had started coming over when Vera wasn't home. It began with innocent reasons, dropping off snacks for the baby or returning something she borrowed. But soon, it became a pattern. Vera didn't think much of it at first. Evelyn was her best friend. After all, one evening, Vera came home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, too quiet. She tiptoed through the hallway and paused at the living room door. Laughter. She heard David's voice, deep and warm, the way he used to sound with her. But it was Evelyn's laugh that followed, soft and almost flirtatious. Vera stepped into the room, forcing a smile. "What's so funny?" she asked. David's face stiffened, and Evelyn quickly stood, brushing invisible crumbs off her dress. "Oh, Vera, you're back early," Evelyn said, avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, the meeting ended sooner than expected," Vera replied, her eyes darting between them. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Over the next few weeks, the unease grew. David became more distant. He barely looked at her, and when he did, his eyes seemed full of guilt. Evelyn, on the other hand, seemed bolder. She stayed longer during her visits and always found a way to compliment David. "You're so lucky, Vera," Evelyn said one day as she helped fold laundry. "David is such a good man. Handsome too." She laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh Vera was used to hearing from her friend. That night, Vera couldn't sleep. The pit in her stomach wouldn't go away. She replayed every moment in her mind. Evelyn's lingering looks, David's coldness, the way their baby cried more whenever David held him. Something was wrong, but she was too afraid to say it out loud. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. David was in the shower when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Vera glanced at it out of habit. A message from Evelyn. Her heart stopped. "I miss you. When can we talk about us again?" Vera's hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Her mind raced. What does she mean? Us? Before she could process it, David stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist. He froze when he saw the phone in her hand. "Vera," he began, his voice low and cautious. "I can explain." But Vera didn't want explanations. Her chest tightened as she shoved the phone at him. "What is this, David? What's going on?" David's silence was deafening. His eyes dropped to the floor, and in that moment, Vera knew. She didn't need him to say the words. Her best friend had betrayed her, and her husband had let it happen. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to cry. "Not yet. How long has this been going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. David opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Evelyn walked in through the front door, carrying a basket of fruit like nothing had happened. When she saw Vera's tear-streaked face and the fury in her eyes, she froze. "Vera, I can explain," Evelyn started. "No," Vera snapped, her voice rising. "I don't want to hear it. You were supposed to be my friend." She turned to David, her voice breaking. "And you? You were supposed to be my husband." Evelyn dropped the basket, and the fruit scattered across the floor. For the first time, she looked guilty, but not enough to stop her from saying the words that shattered everything. "I love him, Vera," Evelyn said softly, her voice trembling. "And he loves me too." The room spun. Vera felt like she couldn't breathe. She clutched her swollen belly, her unborn child kicking inside her, as the weight of their betrayal crushed her. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Vera, please." David tried to reach for her, but she stepped back. "I said get out," she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. Evelyn grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. "This is what we wanted, right?" David hesitated, looking back at Vera, but Evelyn tightened her grip. Together, they left, leaving Vera standing in the middle of the room, broken and alone. The house was eerily quiet after they left. The silence pressed against Vera like a weight, and for the first time, she let herself cry. Her sobs echoed through the empty rooms, each tear carrying the sting of betrayal. How could David, the man who had vowed to love her forever, walk away so easily? And Evelyn, her best friend, how had she turned into a stranger with such cruelty in her eyes? But Vera wasn't just broken. She was angry. She wasn't going to let their betrayal destroy her. She had her baby, her unborn child, and a life she needed to rebuild. The next day, Vera started making changes. She reached out to her family, who immediately rallied around her. Her mother moved in to help with the baby, bringing warmth and strength into the house. Vera also began seeking legal advice, quietly preparing herself for the storm she knew was coming. David and Evelyn didn't stay away for long. A week later, David showed up at the house unannounced. Vera was in the kitchen, her mother feeding the baby in the living room, when she heard the knock. She froze, her heart racing. Opening the door, she found David standing there, looking disheveled and unsure of himself. "Vera," he said softly, "I need to talk to you." She stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger and heartbreak. "What is there to talk about?" "Please," he begged. "It's about Evelyn." At the mention of her name, Vera's chest tightened. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside and let him in. David sat on the couch, his hands fidgeting. "Evelyn, she's not what I thought she was," he began, his voice trembling. "She's been pushing me to marry her. She says she won't wait anymore." Vera's lips curled into a bitter smile. "And what does that have to do with me? You made your choice, David. You walked out on your family for her." David looked up, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in months: regret. "I made a mistake, Vera. I thought I wanted her. But..." He paused, struggling to find the words. "She's not you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with. But the wound was too fresh, too deep. "You don't get to say that now," she said coldly. "Not after what you did." Before David could respond, the door burst open, and Evelyn stormed in. Her eyes were wild, her expression furious. "So this is where you've been," she shouted, her gaze darting between Vera and David. "You think you can just sneak back here like nothing happened?" Vera stepped forward, shielding her mother and the baby. "This is my house, Evelyn. You have no right to barge in here." Evelyn ignored her, focusing on David. "You promised me," she hissed. "You said we'd be together. I gave up everything for you." David stood, his face pale. "I never promised you anything, Evelyn. This isn't working. I can't marry you." Evelyn's face twisted with rage. "You're a liar, David. A coward." She turned to Vera, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you know what he said about you? He told me he stayed with you out of pity. He doesn't love you." The words stung, but Vera held her ground. "And yet, here he is, trying to crawl back. What does that say about you, Evelyn?" Evelyn's hand shot out, slapping David across the face. "You're pathetic," she spat. "Both of you deserve each other." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. David sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. Vera stood there, her heart pounding. She didn't know what hurt more, Evelyn's betrayal, David's weakness, or the chaos they had brought into her life. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let either of them control her anymore. "David," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You need to leave. For good this time." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "Vera, please. Let me make this right. You've done enough," she said, her tone unyielding. "I'll raise our children on my own if I have to. But I won't let you drag me down again." David hesitated, but the determination in her eyes left no room for argument. He nodded slowly, standing to leave. As the door closed behind him, Vera felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Outside, Evelyn waited in her car, her eyes fixed on David as he walked toward her. The look they exchanged was cold, filled with resentment. Their love, if it had ever been real, was already falling apart. Weeks passed, and the once vivid chaos in Vera's life began to settle. She threw herself into caring for her baby and preparing for the arrival of her second child. Her mother's support and the unwavering love of close friends gave her the strength to keep moving forward. The pain lingered, but so did her determination to heal. David, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a miserable spiral. Evelyn was no longer the vibrant, confident woman who had first drawn him in. Her constant demands for marriage and her sharp temper revealed a side of her he hadn't seen, or perhaps had ignored. They fought constantly, their relationship crumbling under the weight of their guilt and bitterness. One evening, after another explosive argument, David left Evelyn's apartment and found himself driving aimlessly through the streets of Apo. Memories of his life with Vera haunted him. The warmth of their home, the sound of their baby's laughter, the quiet moments they had shared. They were all gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Evelyn wasn't faring any better. She realized too late that her obsession with David had cost her everything. Friends had distanced themselves, disgusted by her betrayal, and the man she had fought so hard to win now avoided her at every turn. She sat alone in her apartment, the silence deafening, as regret consumed her. But Vera was no longer the woman they had left behind. She had grown stronger, wiser. She had learned to find joy in the little things, the baby's giggles, the quiet mornings with her mother, the fluttering kicks of the life growing inside her. She was determined to build a new life, one where she didn't depend on anyone but herself. One day, David showed up at her door again. He looked worn, his once confident demeanor replaced by humility. "Vera," he began, his voice soft, "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am." Vera studied him for a long moment. "I forgive you, David," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I won't let your mistakes hold me back anymore. But forgiveness doesn't mean things will ever go back to how they were. We're done, David. And that's final." David nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I understand. I hope one day you'll remember me as the man I was before I lost my way." Vera didn't respond. She didn't need to. She watched as David walked away, his shoulders slumped, and felt a strange sense of closure. As for Evelyn, she moved out of Apo, unable to face the whispers and judgment that followed her. She spent years trying to rebuild her life, haunted by the choices that had led to her downfall. Vera, however, flourished. Her second child was born, a beautiful, healthy baby girl, and her home once again filled with laughter and love. She started a small business from home, pouring her energy into creating a future for herself and her children. And while the scars of betrayal remained, they no longer defined her. She had risen above the pain, stronger and more resilient than ever. In the end, David and Evelyn were left with nothing but their regrets, while Vera proved that even in the face of heartbreak, a woman's strength and grace could rebuild a life worth living.